The Girl with the Silver Eyes, Chapter 5. During the meal, Monica and Nathan talked about other things, leaving Katie out of it most of the time. She didn't care. She had a lot to think about all by herself. Ever since she could remember, she had taken it for granted that she was different from other people. She hadn't wondered why, especially. She just thought it was one of those things that happened, like the two-headed calf that had been born on Mr. Tanner's farm once. The calf had died, but Katie hadn't thought her peculiarities were such that that would happen to her. Until now, as far as she was concerned, she was simply a freak of nature. It hadn't occurred to her that something might have happened to make her different. She didn't think she liked Nathan very much. He was too loud and too bossy, and how could you like someone who smelled of tobacco and beer and called you kid instead of by your name? But maybe Nathan had something about her mother working in the pharmaceutical plant, about the drug Monica had handled and had taken for a headache. It really might have caused something to go wrong with Katie, who had been growing inside of her. And if Nathan was right, Katie forgot to eat, engrossed in the idea that she was the way she was because of the stuff Monica had worked with. What about the babies whose other women had had? All about the same time as Katie herself had been born? Was Taipan Oromine responsible for her silver eyes and this ability to move things by thinking about moving them? And if it was, were those other kids like herself? Somewhere out there in the world were there more different kids who would be her own kind? How could she find out? A trickle of excitement moved like electricity in her veins. Monica had said she still kept in touch with some of the women she had worked with. There had been 4 of them all together who got pregnant while they were working together. That meant there could be 3 more kids out there who wouldn't think Katie was strange at all. Katie, you want a piece of apple pie? She came to, cleaned off her plate, and accepted the pie. It wasn't very good compared to Grandma Welker's pie. Instead of being light and flaky, the crust was tough. And while there were sugar and spices mixed in with the apples, there sure wasn't any butter and no rich cream to pour over it. Store-bought pies weren't any better than store-bought cookies. She noticed that Monica and Nathan didn't eat their crust either. She wondered if Monica ever cooked or baked anything that took more than 15 minutes. That was one thing she was going to miss about Grandma Welker, her cooking. She expected maybe Monica would assign her the job of doing dishes, but she didn't. At home in Delaney, Katie had always either washed or wiped the supper dishes. Here, though, there was a dishwasher, and while Nathan carried his beer and his cigarette into the living room and turned on the TV, Monica quickly rinsed the dishes and stowed them in the dishwasher. After that, she opened up the paper to the babysitter ads and started calling the numbers. I found one, she said in relief after the 4th call. A Mrs. Gerald. She'll be here in the morning at 8. And Katie, I hope for better things from you tomorrow. If there's any difficulty at all, I want to know precisely what it is. Nathan was watching a ball game, and Monica sat beside him on the couch. Katie didn't care about watching baseball any more than she enjoyed playing it. She withdrew to her room and finished The Scarlet Pimpernel. Mrs. M was right. It was a good book. She decided she probably had time to read The Western by Louis L'Amour before it was time to turn off the light. It wasn't very long. And all the time she was reading, somewhere in the back of her mind, Katie was making plans. Mrs. Gerald arrived at 5 minutes to 8, and Monica let her in. She didn't look anything like Mrs. Hornecker, but Katie didn't think she'd like her any better. Mrs. Gerald was fat, grossly, disgustingly fat, and she made herself clear at once. I don't do no housework, she said, and I got to catch my bus at exactly 5:10. It's the last one that runs out to my neighborhood. And I don't walk out to the park with the kids, things like that. I got corns, and my feet hurt too much to walk to the park. Even without the corns, Katie guessed that the woman's feet would hurt just from holding up all that weight. Yes, well, I have to run, Monica said. I hope you and Katie get along all right. And if you wouldn't mind putting the meatloaf in the oven at about 4:30 and 3 baked potatoes. Put in 3 potatoes to bake. I don't cook neither, Mrs. G said, shifting a wad of gum from one cheek to the other. I can put in the meatloaf, Katie said. She knew Monica had it already mixed, standing in the refrigerator. She wasn't sure what Monica was paying Mrs. G, but it seemed like a waste of money to pay someone to be in the apartment doing nothing, just so Katie could have company she didn't want. Mrs. G was not a reader. She was a TV addict. She poured herself a cup of coffee and carried it to the living room and settled herself in the biggest chair. She watched a game show, and then the soap opera started. Katie didn't stay around. She only watched The Edge of Night or Search for Tomorrow or As the World Turns when she was too sick to read. But she did keep an interested eye on Mrs. G. During the commercials, Mrs. G tottered out to the kitchen for snacks. Watching the diminishing supply of fruit, cookies, and sandwich materials, Katie wondered if there'd be enough food to last out the day. The coffee cup, sitting on the floor beside Mrs. G's chair, was joined by banana peels and breadcrumbs, and finally, a beer can. And in the kitchen, the crumbs and stains accumulated. Maybe she wouldn't have to do anything about this one, Katie thought. Monica would get fed up with this slob all by herself. She didn't waste all her time that morning, though, thinking about the new sitter. She went into Monica's bedroom and began to go through her desk drawers. If only she could find some of the correspondence Monica had had from the women who worked with her at that drug company. For someone who kept a reasonably tidy apartment, Monica sure had a messy desk. There were all kinds of old bills, canceled checks, and odds and ends. Monica didn't have any real family. Her parents had both died when she was a teenager, and she didn't like the aunt who reared her, so they only wrote once or twice a year. She had some cousins, and though she never talked about them, Katie guessed she wasn't good friends with them either. There was so much junk that for a while, Katie was sure Monica was the kind of person who saved all of her letters, but at the end of the top drawer she hadn't found any. She closed that drawer and started on the next one. Might be something here. There was a photograph album and what looked like keepsakes. Katie laid the album on top of the desk and began to read through it. There was Monica in a cap and gown graduating from high school. She was smiling and very pretty. There were lots of other snapshots of people who didn't look familiar, and then one that did. Katie didn't need the handwritten caption beneath the picture of the dark-haired, laughing young man. Joe. That was her father. She wondered where he was and if he even knew yet that Grandma Welker had died. He wasn't much of one for writing letters, although he usually sent a card for his mother's birthday and one for Katie's. They were usually just a little bit late, as if Joe didn't remember until the actual day. And at Christmas, he sent a box for them both. Katie still had the teddy bear he'd given her when she was 7. She'd slept with it for almost 2 years. Last Christmas, though, he'd only sent a card and a check and told Grandma to buy Katie something. The something had been a new winter coat and a pair of boots, and while she loved the cherry red coat with its matching hood, Katie wished he'd picked out something especially for her himself, like the teddy bear. Of course, she was way too old for teddy bears now. She wished she could let him know how much she'd like to have books, but he didn't stay in one place long enough for her to write to him very much. And when she did write, he didn't write back, although sometimes he'd call on the phone. Katie always felt excited when he called, and shy too. Ahead of time, she'd think of what she wanted to say the next time she got the chance. And then when he was talking long distance from Texas or Montana or whatever, her mind would go blank. Last time he'd said to her, "Remember, I loved you, baby." And after she'd hung up, Katie went out in the backyard with the chickens and avoided everybody for a while. She wasn't sure why that had made her sad to be told that her father loved her, but it had. She forgot what she'd come looking for, slowly turning the pages of the album. There were her parents on their wedding day, looking young and skinny and happy, and there was a picture of herself as an infant, chubby and stupid-looking, sitting on a blanket. Katie found a lot of pictures of herself when she was very small. After she got about 2 years old, she could tell by the number of candles on the cake that the picture was taken of her on her 2nd birthday. They didn't seem to take so many any longer. Was that because they lost interest, or because she wasn't cute anymore, or what? Maybe by that time they all knew she was peculiar, and so they didn't care about pictures anymore. She leafed onward and saw herself beside a Christmas tree when she was 3. Must have been when she was 3, because by the time she was 4, Katie had been with Grandma Welker. Katie studied her own small face. She looked happy then. She hadn't found out for sure yet that she was peculiar. After that, there weren't any more pictures of Joe Welker. There were Katie's school pictures, always solemn and usually with the light reflecting off her glasses, and she usually looked scared, never happy. There were more snapshots of Monica with people Katie didn't know, and Katie almost overlooked the important one because it was just a bunch of young women smiling into a too bright sun. Nothing was written underneath it, but on impulse, Katie slipped it out of the little corner things that held it in the book and turned it over. The gang at Curtis. Gloria Hagland, Monica Welker, Stephanie Donahue, Sandra Casey, Fern Lamont, and Paula Van Allsburg. Katie turned it back over with more interest to restudy the snapshot. Gloria, Monica had said. Gloria was one of the women who'd worked next to her. She tried to see if any of them had their stomachs bulging out, as if they were pregnant, but the photographer had stood too close to them. He didn't get their stomachs in the picture. Still, she knew their names now. If only there would be something in Monica's things to indicate where they were and which of them had had the babies. The babies who would be almost 10 years old and who might be like herself. Katie kept going through the rest of the album, but it didn't have anything interesting in it. Some snapshots of Nathan at the beach, his muscles bulging, and some of Monica in a bikini. Grandma Welker would have made disapproving noises over that one. She thought bathing suits ought to cover up your belly button. The album had taken enough time so that Katie's breakfast had worn off. She went out to get something to eat, and Mrs. G didn't even notice. She was eating a Danish that Katie thought was intended for Monica's breakfast tomorrow, her eyes glued to a screen where a man and a woman were having a heated argument. Mrs. G had eaten all the bananas except one overripe one. Katie looked at it and decided she didn't want it either. She made herself a peanut butter sandwich and decided she might as well eat the last orange in the bowl before Mrs. G got to that. Back at the desk, she was careful not to get either juice or peanut butter on the things she sorted through. And this time she had a little luck, or at least she thought it was. Monica had a box of things like old Christmas cards and Valentines, and one of the first things that showed up when Katie emptied the box onto the desk was a birth announcement. She snatched it up eagerly, looking at the date before she read the names. September, 10 years ago. The baby had been born 17 days after Katie's birthday on the 10th. A girl. Carrie Louise Lamont, born to Fern and Charles. Katie was so excited that she nearly choked on the peanut butter sandwich. That girl was one of them. And now she, Katie, knew the father's name too. Was there any chance they still lived here in the city? She had to go out to the living room to find a phone book. Mrs. G was chewing away like crazy, and she'd poured herself some more coffee. The cup had left rings on the coffee table, and there were crumbs inside the rings. Mrs. G had had a peanut butter sandwich too. She didn't pay any attention to Katie. The quarrel on the screen had ended, and the man and woman were kissing each other passionately. Katie averted her eyes from both the TV and the sitter and opened the phone book. Lamont, Charles Lamont. Lambert, Lambeth, Lamb, Lemon, Lamoureux. No Lamont at all. Disappointment stabbed at her. It had seemed an ordinary name, one that she'd find half a dozen of anyway, so she'd have to call them all. Of course, the Lamonts could have moved anywhere. She wondered what Monica would do if she asked about them. She'd certainly realized that Katie had been listening to her conversation with Nathan, and she probably wouldn't like that at all. And if she knew Katie had heard it all, and that they thought she was strange, and they were uncomfortable being around her, it wouldn't exactly be a step toward having a good family relationship. On the other hand, Katie didn't think she could actually come right out and admit to Monica just how different she was and ask for her help in finding the other kids who might be like her. And it was possible that those kids had never said anything about what they could do either, especially if their parents were worried and frightened the way Monica was. She put the telephone book aside and stood up. There was a commercial on, and Mrs. G turned her head away from the screen for a minute. "As long as you're up, bring me the shaker of salt, will ya?" She had an apple, polishing it against her enormous belly. Mrs. G had only been here a few hours, and already the living room looked like a garbage dump. Katie stared at her in disgust and decided to bring the salt without going after it. It was a fairly heavy shaker, and Katie didn't do too good a job of steering. It bumped into the wall coming through the doorway and spilled a little when it landed in Mrs. G's lap. The sitter didn't even notice. Her attention was back on the screen, where a bunch of people in white uniforms were pretending they were doctors and nurses. "Thanks, kid," was all the woman said. Later, Katie wondered if, for just a moment, she hadn't been really crazy, because she had an impulse to do something to shake the stupid woman out of her eating and TV watching rut. If she'd known how to make herself bleed without hurting, she'd have tried that just to see if Mrs. G noticed. Instead, she created a terrific wind, the best one she'd ever done, and sent things swirling around the living room. The curtains swayed, the newspaper slithered off the coffee table onto the floor, the pages of an open book flipped rapidly, and then, when Katy gritted her teeth and closed her eyes and used the final ounce of power left within her, she swooshed the wind across Mrs. G so that it blew her hair off. Well, after a few horrified seconds, Katy realized it was a wig. A mop of hair fell off and dangled over the arm of chair. Mrs. G wasn't bald, she just had thin hair, and the hairpiece was to make it look like there was more of it. At least that got her attention. The sitter looked around, clutched at her denuded head, and watched as the TV guide fluttered to a stop on the rug. "Shut the doors! The wind's blowing everything to pieces," she yelled. She picked up the wiglet, which looked like some strange little dead creature, and settled it back on her head. "While you're up, switch over to Channel 4, will you?" Katy gave up. Let Monica deal with her. She went back into the bedroom and began going through more of the things from Monica's box. She was looking for birth announcements, personal letters from any of the people in the picture of the drug company, that sort of thing. By the time she had finished, Katy had found 2 more announcements of births within a month of her own: Dale John Casey and Eric Arnold Van Allsburg. 4 of them, all born in September, almost 10 years ago, to women who had worked with a drug that was so dangerous the company had stopped making it. Katy kept out the 3 birth announcements and shoved everything else back into the box and replaced it in the desk drawer. A new tremor of excitement ran through her. Somehow, she thought, she had to find the other 3 kids and see if they were like her.